how do I stop a nib from singing? And actually I had somebody else that kind of jumped in and wanted this question answered as well, that asked a lot more stuff to it, but I like the simplicity of this question. So, well, Spidey hole, singing of a nib, so for those of you that don't know, if you have a nib that is singing, some people call it squeaking, but basically what's happening is you're writing, okay, and it's making some kind of audible hum or squeak or, you know, chirp or something like that as you're writing. Now, it's not going to be like one continuous, you know, kind of thing. It's usually going to be quick because your strokes are usually fairly quick. What's happening is you have, for whatever reason, one of the tines of your nib is actually vibrating at the exact resonant frequency of the nib itself, and it's causing an audible sound to come out. Not unlike a bowstring when you're playing a violin or a cello or something like that. Same kind of concept. It's vibrating because of the friction between the paper and the nib. It's vibrating in such a way that it's making an audible noise. Sometimes, if it's really severe, it can be so extreme that it actually atomizes the ink and causes the ink to spray out and either leave a fatter line than it should or actually like spat out onto the paper. Those are pretty extreme cases. That is something I think you see more commonly with like vintage pens and stuff like that. I have never come across that, but I've read about it. I've never come across that with new pens. So why is that happening? There's a lot of different reasons. That's kind of the cause ultimately. It's kind of a combination of the nib design itself, the length of the nib and stuff like that. That's a factor. Your writing speed and list and all that, and the not list. That notification just came up that said the word list on it, and I said it. Your writing, and it has to do a lot with the way the nib is tuned itself. No pun intended with the singing tune. I'll take credit for the pun though. I'll say it's intended because it's kind of clever. There's a couple different reasons. It could be that the nib tines are spread apart a little bit. It could be that they're a little too close together. And usually if they're too close together, you're going to get more of a clicking than a singing. If you're getting a clicking, that means your nib tines are so close that they're actually like kind of hitting each other as you're writing. That's kind of a different thing than what I'm talking about. So that tends to sometimes get associated with it, but it has more to do with it when the tines are spread apart because the individual tines are operating independently in that way. But it will usually be in like a certain direction. You'll get a squeak or a noise in that one direction. And that's because that one tine often is ground in such a way that it is causing that friction to happen. So what happens when they make these nibs, they have the nib itself, and when the nib is initially made and stamped and all that, there's no slit in the tines. It's just, they do the tipping first. Well, they usually stamp it out, form the shape, they put the tipping on there, and then what they do is they cut the slit. And they do that, there's a couple different ways to do it, but usually it's like a very small cutting wheel, and it will spin, and they'll put the nib right in there. And in fact, fun little fact here, the reason why there's a breather hole on the top of most nibs often is just that gives them a consistent place to stop when they are cutting the nibs. When they're cutting the slit in the nibs. That's really about the only reason. It doesn't drastically affect the performance of the nib. It's more of an aesthetic thing, and it gives them a firm place to stop. So that's a fun little fact for you. That's why some nibs, like Lamy nibs, they don't have the breather hole in the top, and you're like, what's going on? How do they still write? It's because it doesn't really affect anything. So anyway, that was a fun little fact, little Easter egg for you. But anyway, what happens is they're cutting it, and it's a very kind of a rough cut when they do that. So then it needs to be kind of tuned and stuff like that. And every now and then, they might not just get it all. So it's a kind of a rough cut when they do that initial cut, and especially if there's any leftover kind of on the tines, on the tip, if they don't polish that off all the way, you could get just one little piece of something that's hanging off of that nib that just so happens to hit when you're writing and your speed and your pressure and your angle and stuff like that, that it gets that squeak. So they usually are able to get that kind of thing out of there when they do the tuning and stuff, but every now and then something will slip through perhaps, or it's just the way, it's a pen that's a vintage pen that's been used for years by somebody that holds a pen a very different way. It was never an issue. And then you go to hold it your way and all of a sudden it's singing. It happens. Some people actually don't mind it and like it, and they celebrate it as something, but for other people, they don't like it. It's usually something you can get rid of because of the way that it can come about and the different aspects to it that could be. It's usually better to leave it to a professional if it's something that really bothers you or affects the writing, especially if it's like spattering and all that kind of stuff. But ultimately, what's probably going to happen is it's going to be just a matter of smoothing the nib with a micromesh or a mylar or something like that. If it's a new pen that you've got and it's having that issue, I would say exchange it, return it, do whatever, because it's probably not something you want to mess with if it's a brand new pen that you just bought, unless it's you like tinkering and it's not something that's that big a deal to you. But if you try smoothing and tuning and stuff like that, you're voiding the warranty of the pen, basically. So you want to get it taken care of. The retailer, I know we would exchange it here, whatever, if that's happening. If it's an older pen and something you don't mind messing around with yourself, it's not like you are incapable. So oftentimes, if you're going in a certain direction, whatever the direction you're going in, let's say it's always singing when you're going to the left, okay? So like I'm going from my right to my left. If that's the case, then it's going to be the right time, usually that's happening, because that's the one that's kind of dragging as I'm writing on that cross stroke. If that's the case, then I know that that's the time that's usually happening. So what I would do is I would actually take and bend the tine up a little bit, the opposite one, leaving the right tine to be lower. And then I would take a little bit of micromesh or mylar, depending on how severe it is. Mylar is finer than micromesh, so mylar might be a little safer to try. And I would just kind of take and just nick a little bit of that inside part of that nib and just kind of hit that a little bit and then try it again and see if that does it. Sometimes that's all it takes. It literally could be that simple of just like, and then you write with it and it's beautiful. Other times it might be more severe. I would say if it's anything more severe than just a couple of little quick things with a micromesh or mylar, then you probably shouldn't mess with it too much because you might do more harm than good if you don't know what you're doing. Even that kind of thing, like I've messed around with it a little bit and know the general principles, but I'm not like a nib tuner, right? So I don't know how to fix it when it gets beyond that point. So that's when you would want to get it perfected by a pro. Cool?